culture is always evolving. It's not a static thing that is owned by HR, and it's an initiative that is a list of values that get placed on a website.
Yeah.
It is an ongoing practice and should continue to be looked at as an opportunity to integrate how we're working into everything we're doing.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the HR Leaders Podcast. On today's episode, I'm joined by Melissa Daimler, who's a Chief Learning Officer at Udemy, a global keynote speaker, and author of the book Reculturing. During the episode, Melissa shares how to design a company culture to connect with strategy and purpose for lasting success. As always, before we jump into the video, make sure you hit the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and follow on your favorite podcast platform. With that being said, let's jump in. Melissa, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you, Chris. It's great to be here. I'm doing really well.
Nice. I see the books in the background there. I love you snuck them in for everyone listening. Love it. Yes. Love it.
Yeah.
Firstly,
not subtle at all.
Listen, before we get into that, how are you? How are things?
Things are very busy in a good way. I'm starting to travel more, which has been really amazing. I just got back from Korea and Japan. So it's good to get out again and connect with people around the world.
Nice. And now you're, how's it feel to be a published author? How does that feel?
I'm still settling into it. It feels really good. I mean, it's been something that I've been thinking about for a long time. And you and I were just talking. I really wanted to write a book that wasn't just a book. I wanted to write something meaningful and impactful. And I feel really lucky that the timing of this, I think, is really good because a lot of people are trying to figure out the playbook for HR right now in a hybrid world. What does culture look like specifically?
Mm-hmm. And for those who probably heard it in the intro already, the book's Reculturing. Great name, by the way. Who came up with the name? Who gets that? Who gets that star?
There's a story in the book about that. I mean, I had realized as I was researching this, I didn't know until I started researching this, that culture as a term had been around for 70 years. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, is because I feel like there were so many definitions of culture that just were nebulous, vague, fluffy. And as I started thinking about it more, I realized that it is more of a verb. It's not a noun. It's something that we need to be continuing to evolve, like we think about strategy. And so in my research, I came upon this idea of unschooling, which is this movement where parents just got, out of frustration again, frustrated with the education system. And so how do we kind of unlearn or unschool and kind of recreate what schooling is? And so the original version was unculturing. And then I realized there is so much goodness to some of the work that's been done over 70 years. So I'm not trying to undo everything, but I am trying to kind of redefine and redesign what culture is. So that's how we came upon the title.
Love it. No, I'm glad I asked now. It's always a cool thought. People don't probably realize the amount of work that goes into just to the name.
Well, and it's so funny because I actually did work with a book coach, and she was really great with me because so often I think when we're on this path, we think we have to have the title first and then everything else will come. And I just had to let that go. And I realized that I'm just going to write, I'm going to trust this process and it'll evolve. And I think that ultimately is better because it wasn't like I was pushing it. And, in fact, when it came and when I finally kind of thought about it in my head, it felt right.
Nice. Yeah. You kind of discover it along the way, right? And love it. So then on that point, then how do you define culture? Because I've got about 1,000 versions I've probably heard.
Yeah. I mean, there are. I mean, there's so many. I mean, people talk about it's the personality. It's what happens when the boss leaves the room. It's happiness. I joke that I even had listened to a webinar when I was writing the book, and this renowned HR leader who's been around for a long time said, oh, it's just leaves on a tree and the strategy is the trunk. So I wanted a definition that gave agency to leaders inside companies and was something that we could do something with. And I've experienced that as well in the companies that I've worked in. And so I wanted it and thought that it should go beyond just values, because you have a lot of companies who have similar values. But if you peel that back and you look at the behaviors, which is a component of how I define culture, it is very different. So it's three things. It's behaviors, processes, and practices. And so, behaviors are, again, kind of an extension and an expression of what values are. Processes are the processes that are part of any kind of employee life cycle. So how we hire, how we onboard, how we promote, how we recognize. And then the practices are things like also what we do every day. So our meetings, how we communicate, how we learn, how we connect. So I think if we can embed and integrate the behaviors that we define into those processes and practices, that to me is culture.
Mm-hmm. And already just those three things, it gives people a framework. Immediately, mm-hmm. you can kind of dive in immediately to those three areas, like you said, and then start tailoring it around your organization, around your business, around your values as well. It's not it's not binary. As well. Super interesting. Like when you were writing this, who were you writing it for? Was it the HR leader? Was it leaders and overall? Like who's the avatar?
It's funny because my publisher kept saying, you have to have one audience.
They always say that.
And it's so hard because, of course it's for leaders, but I also wanted to write it for all employees because I do believe, and I say this in the book, that culture is everybody's job. I don't think there is a head of culture, which some companies have. I think everybody is creating culture every day, and you're either strengthening it or weakening it. And I do think that it is for both audiences. I think primarily a lot of leaders, HR leaders, heads of learning have been leveraging it. But I also think for employees, it's good just to get context of how do we really think about culture, and some of the questions that you can ask as an employee if you think either the culture isn't there or you think there is some hypocrisy, that these are the values, but then you see that this is what's going on. So I wanted it to be a tool for both leaders and employees.
Mm-hmm. What are some of those questions that you would ask to organizations? If a company's thinking about reculturing, what are the questions we should be asking ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the questions is when you look at the values, how do those express itself? Do those values show up in how mm-hmm. you're interviewing? When you're looking at things like recognition and promotions, is it really clear about how to work? I think of culture ultimately as how people work together. And so, one of the ways to get to those behaviors is, when things are going well and people are working effectively together, what is happening? If you had a video camera looking at a team or people, what are they doing? What are they not doing? So I think there's a way to ask those questions that isn't blaming or it's not meant to, provide some kind of negative opportunity to say, why aren't we doing this? It's mm-hmm. more of, like if we really believe that this is our culture and these are our values, how do we make sure that they show up on a more consistent basis? Yeah.
It's interesting you mentioned around like, how do you package, when things are going well, how do you package that and recreate that? Like what is going in? Because we only tend to look at things when things are going wrong. when things are going wrong, all of a sudden there's a microscope and we're trying to figure it out. But when things are going great, why are they going great? Why? Mm-hmm. What is it that's working as well? And that's something that as a startup, me and Shane, we've had a chat about a few times. Like, how do we package that? Like, because we do things, but I don't know how we did it. You know, I don't have a playbook is what I'm saying, of how we created this. And it'd be great to know, what is success? What does that look like? What are the ingredients that go into that?
Mm-hmm. I do think that sometimes we focus too much on failure. And I do think, to your point, we can learn a lot from success as well. And so one of the things that we talk about here at Udemy is just making sure that we have time to reflect, because I think we're all moving so fast that without that pause, we don't know what we did well or what we didn't do well. And so that is one of the practices that we've integrated throughout the organization is, you know, after a big project, some people call it after action review or postmortem, but it doesn't even have to take long. I think that's the other misnomer, is that, oh my God, I don't have a whole day to kind of walk through this. Take 15 minutes and just kind of brainstorm. Hey, what worked about that? How do we want to improve? And so, yeah, I think it's a really important practice to focus on what you do well.
Yeah, there's something my coach Chester has been helping me and Shane on, is because we're so like in the grind, and that we're like, we delivered that, on to the next thing. And we just don't take the time to even just to appreciate what we've achieved sometimes. Like, and take time with the team, just celebrate the moment. And we're like, all right, that's next, you know, and as well. So tomorrow we're going out as a team actually to celebrate some recent successes. And we're trying to be more intentional about that, and making sure the team understand that we do see you, we do see the work, and together we did this. We should be proud of ourselves. Whereas before we would achieve something great and then it'd be on to the next one. And it's such a shame, such a missed opportunity. And also talking about culture. Go on, sorry.
Yeah. No, I was going to say, we are a nexting world. I mean, it's always next.
Nexting world.
I think
I haven't heard that one. Yeah. What would you say is what during the research that you did for the book was something that, like, was there a surprise, something that you wasn't expecting during the research, something that stood out to you?
I mean, I think I was surprised, you know, one, just that this had been around so long. There were a lot of men, and, you know, older men, no offense, nothing against them, but it was biased toward older men who weren't practitioners, who kind of created a lot of these models. So people who weren't really experienced in working inside an organization. They were researchers, professors. So a lot of it was abstract or theoretical. And I was really committed to, and I wanted to write a book that I wanted to read as a practitioner, kind of on the front lines. Give me some real examples and experiences, both, again, failures and successes, of how to do this. And so I guess I was surprised that with all of the research and books and articles out there on culture, there wasn't kind of a framework or a real definition for a practitioner.
And I can tell you from interviewing a lot of people on the show, that is often the case. In every field that you go into, a lot of the time it's, you know, and it's great research, and there is great academic research and great studies, etc. But the vast majority have never lived and breathed the work, you know, and it's very different. I like, we've got an event coming up called our Future Work Summit. And what I actually do is I put 3 panelists who are academics and experts, and I put 3 CHROs on the same panel. And I just love just asking questions and sitting back saying, well, this is what the research is. And then the CHRO is like, well, this is what it means to actually do that. And we do it for like 4 hours across different topics, and it creates the most amazing content out of it, because you got the theory and then the execution, the actual reality of it. Yeah,
and they're both good. I mean, I have learned, you know, I learned a lot in formal education. I got a graduate degree in organizational development. But it is something, it's messy when you start applying it. And one of the things that I've been interested in my entire career is this idea of systems thinking. And I always felt like in my work, I was always trying to connect different pieces. And so I talk about that in the book too, that, you know, purpose, strategy, and culture need to be all connected. You know, Peter Drucker has this famous quote of culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I jokingly say that they need to have breakfast together because both of them are important. And, throughout my career, I've always looked at, okay, if this is the strategy, then, what's the org design? How are people going to work together? What are those behaviors? What are some of those practices that we need to reinforce? And so, I would get frustrated as an employee when those connections weren't there. Experiences of, we have our values and we have our 50 competencies and we'll send you away to a training that has nothing to do with what we're going to reinforce internally at the company.
Yeah.
You're going to get promoted, but everything that we talked about in those values and what we just trained you on has, those aren't even relevant. And so I've always been interested in, how do we make this really clear for employees? Like, if these are our values, these are the behaviors that we expect from you, then how do we then help you learn those? So what are the skills that you need to kind of exemplify those behaviors? And then how do we kind of continue to reinforce those? So when it's time to be promoted or when it's time to move to maybe another project, we can identify people who have those particular skills that we said were important to the organization.
Definitely. What would you say are some of those skills that leaders need to have? Because, that's been a whole nother conversation, which has been up for debate recently. You're talking, Josh Burson talking about power skills and, you already know where I'm going with this. I'd love to hear your opinion on that.
No. He's a good partner with us. I think there's basic skills that every organization needs. I think I talk a lot, and I've talked about this with Josh too. I think context matters. And I think we're also overwhelmed. And so it's part of our job now. It used to be that we had to be the expert in everything. Now I think we're more what I would call curators and contextualizers. So how do we take all of the goodness from Udemy, from YouTube, from real experiences and curate that into a learning experience for people that is relevant? And so I think basic leadership skills, again, have been there for a long time. The skills that I think have come out in the past couple of years through the pandemic, which is to me a silver lining, are, again, things that I've thought about are needed throughout my career, but coaching, like doubling down on, how do you actively listen? How do you actively ask questions? And I think coaching is a skill for everybody, frankly, not just leaders and managers. This idea of empathy, really understanding kind of where somebody's coming from. Managers had to do that through the pandemic. We were all kind of in everybody's living room or kitchen or whatever, wherever that was, dealing with whatever situation we were dealing with, along with trying to work through it. And so I think there's this opportunity for leaders to connect more and be able to be more of that coach than just kind of the, this leader that just sets direction and strategy and checks in on how you're doing. Again, I think the good leaders have done that for a while, but I think the pandemic amplified that for everybody.
You're right. Like kind of, I saw like the people that are already doing it amplified them, but people who weren't doing it also amplified that.
Right.
All of those people that were micromanaging, managing person, like all of the, things that you already know, and everyone listening, it kind of exacerbated it and 10 times worse when they were removed from an office environment.
Yeah. And I feel like that was with everything. Like the companies that already did think of culture as how work gets done, it wasn't dependent on a ping pong table or free food or happy hours in an office. It was, we need to be really intentional about our processes and practices. We already thought about our values and behaviors, and that, yes, it was hard for everybody, but it was a little easier for those companies where they've already been doing it and talking about it.
And they got the trust, right?
Yeah. Yes, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, but going back to skills, there's been a lot more talk about skills in the industry, as you well know, and even to the point where, jobs are going to go away. It's just about skills. So I do think it's important as an organization to really be clear about, those business skills you need, leadership skills you need, and then whatever technical and functional skills you need. And then again, reinforcing those through whatever mechanism you can reinforce them. I mean, one of the values that we have is always learning, no surprise. But one of our behaviors is all around constructive debate, because we've realized that part of good learning means debating and making sure that
that's true, yeah,
we're understanding different points of view. And so it's a behavior, and it is a skill that a lot of people don't have. And so in order for us to make sure that that behavior shows up more consistently, we're building out learning experiences on how do you have debate. And when it does show up in a meeting, we're naming it. Like, you know, I had a meeting a couple of days ago and it got a little heated. I was a little fiery that day, and we were having constructive debate, and it was very respectful, and we came out of it with a completely different outcome than we would have if that didn't come up. But what was interesting is we named it. We said that was just constructive debate. And
nice.
So
you got a language now.
I think if we, yeah. And I think if so often, and, you know, again, we talked about this for years, but like when we're trying to work through conflict or have different points of view, I think people conflate it with, oh my God, we're being mean. Like, I don't want to be mean. And in fact, I think it's being mean if we don't allow people's voices to be heard. And so that's just an example of how do you kind of tie these behaviors that I think are core to any kind of culture to the skills that are needed in an organizational level.
And it's exactly the combination of both, which is what shapes culture.
Yeah.
In your organization. And I was just thinking about examples in my own business, by the way, about that debate. And I love the fact that you can define it, because sometimes you can get heated, you know, people can feel like they're not being heard, or, you know, it can be an argument. Over the years, I've always kind of just assumed positive intent, like regardless of, because no one's coming to the table trying to make you feel bad about your idea, or, you know, no one's coming. I assume no one is coming to do that, and it is often the case. So I always make sure I speak to the team and understand that when we have these conversations, it's not that you're wrong and that they're right. It's just everyone having that space to be heard, and just always assume positive intent when we're having these conversations. But I love the fact that you named it, right? Because it when you're in the moment, you're like, we're here. This is what this means. Because a lot of companies don't have the language to define that. I love that. What are some of the
learning moment?
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah. And some of those moments is what saved my company literally during the pandemic. I can say right now that when I said to the team, I don't know what we're going to do. The whole world's just closed down. We can either furlough everyone and wait it out, or we can meet and figure out a new way forward. And trust me, that was a heated debate and conversation, right? But at the end of it, we all said, all right, this is where we're going. This is the direction. We've all agreed. It took a while to get there as well. But without creating that psychological safety, and without creating that environment where people will speak up and challenge the CEO, because trust me, the idea I had going in was completely different to the idea that we had came in, and that's okay. And I was like, that's fine as well, right? So it's so important on so many levels.
The other thing you said, Chris, which I think is really important, and I do talk about this in the book, is language. I think we completely make things too complex. So I've been at companies where we've had a vision and a mission and a purpose and a charter, and we have OKRs, but then we have KPIs, and then we have values, but those are also principles. And, you know, so it's just, I do feel like that's really important, because especially now there's so much change going on in organizations, and, you know, what we can control, let's control that. Let's make it simpler for people. So pick one. Is it a vision or a mission? Like, it doesn't even matter, but pick one, define it, and, you know, pick one framework for how you're strategizing. You know, pick like don't have more than 15 behaviors, please. You know, I mean, we've all had those binders. I've been around long enough.
Binders.
Don't have them.
I love it.
The binders of competencies. Like, when you have more than 15, it's like, forget it. I can't remember.
Yeah.
I mean, 15 is probably even too many.
I've had CHROs on the show. I've had CHROs on the show, and I won't name them, and they've said it, and I'm like, oh, can you tell me those? And they couldn't tell me. The chief people officer of a business. And I'm like, oh, we'll edit that out. We'll edit that out. Who's going to remember that many?
And so I would rather have fewer and focus on how do we exemplify those versus I think so much time is spent trying to remember them.
It's that we've already lost people already at that point. I want to return back to the book. You know, what are the sort of 3 parts of reculturing? Could you kind of break that down for everyone?
Yeah. Well, it's behaviors, processes, and practices. Those are the 3 components. I've also added skills. If I were to write this again, I would probably make those more.
And in terms of let's start with the first one. What would be a practical example of something that our audience can take away and use in their business?
Behaviors?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a few things behind behaviors. There's criteria that I have. I mean, I do think, especially in Silicon Valley, we get cute around things like hustle harder or don't sweat the small stuff. And that doesn't mean anything to people around the world. And I also think it needs to be in the positive. It needs to be inclusive. It needs to be simple. It also needs to be aspirational and foundational. So I get that question a lot. Like, should the behaviors be where we're going or kind of...
Yeah, that's good. That's a good question, though.
Exemplify what we're doing. I think it's both. The example I give a lot is a lot of companies talk about we're innovative or, we have a value of being innovative. But if you peel that back and work on codifying that a little bit more, it could mean 2 different things to 2 different companies. And I was working with 2 companies at the same time who both had that value. One company wanted to slow things down a bit. They were feeling like way too many ideas were getting to the point where they were getting too far ahead with the ideas. Like they were spending way too much time, way too much money, and realizing that it wasn't really the idea that they wanted. So they wanted to slow things down and give people time to really think through what those ideas are. The other company wanted to speed things up. They're like, we're taking way too much time. We're processing it too much. We want to make it safe for people to come up with ideas, even if they're not perfect. And so a behavior that we created that was aspirational for the company that had the value of innovation, they wanted to slow down, was we ask each other why. And usually that question, we're taught, oh my God, don't ask why, because it just puts people on the defense. But in this case, it was a signal to employees and to each other that, okay, we need to slow it down a little bit. They created a whole framework for questions on, why are we doing this? How would it impact the business? Who needs to be involved? So that was that company. The other company had a behavior of something like we make it safe to get to version 1 quickly. And so there was this shift in how people were with each other, where they reminded each other that, again, it doesn't have to be perfect, but let's get to V1 and then we'll iterate. And so again, 2 different companies, same value, different aspirations, so then different behaviors.
It's so interesting because like even the models of innovation in companies change. So some companies have their innovation office separate. So they have an innovation hub offsite removed, and it's almost like 2 subcultures. You kind of like the culture of your organization, and then you have this other campus, this the innovation spot, and it's got a completely different type of culture because they feel like they can't coincide, if that makes sense. In the same. I've seen really different approaches. I love the why question, by the way. I've learned that one the hard way from my daughter, who's 4 years old, because the kids, they're like, but why? And you're like, because of that. And then they're like, but why? And then you start asking yourself, why do we even do that? that way.
Right.
And it's like the curiosity, right, from kids.
Right.
I found myself quite a few times being like, why do I do that? Robin's asked me, like, I don't actually know, Robin, why I do that. It's just that's the way we do things. And it's important as organizations that we look at each of those things, like you're saying. And why are we doing that just because that's the way?
Yeah.
I love asking that question with the team. I love it.
That's what I refer to when I talk about practices. I think so often companies create kind of rituals, habits, I call it practices, early on.
Mm-hmm.
And because they don't review those practices, it just becomes habit.
Yeah.
And, the classic one is, all hands meetings. I talk about this.
You're sitting there like this. Why am I here? Or meetings you don't need to be in.
Yeah. I mean, as you grow also globally, we had these meetings on Friday afternoons, and it was great for everybody in San Francisco. But that's, weekend time already in London.
It's my Friday evening.
Tokyo. Yeah, Tokyo is Saturday. And so it was, it seems so obvious, but, we had to kind of relook at that practice of the weekly all hands and say, okay, we need to do it at different times. We need to have it, be different hosts throughout the world. And it was because, somebody said, look, this doesn't work anymore. So I do think we need to, especially as we're growing as an organization, look at our practices and evolve with them.
Well, that's a good example, because I was going to ask you, what are the practices that need to be reviewed in the hybrid working environment? Any other ones that come to mind? That's a great one.
I do think that, meetings are such a big deal now. And I caution even our own leaders sometimes when, I hear that question, how do we get our culture back? Which is code for how do we get people back in the office? And
that's so good. That's so true.
I think it's not about the office is good and, being outside of the office is bad, because we are in a hybrid world now, and we do, most companies do have a lot of remote employees who aren't even near an office. And so I think the idea of looking at an office as just another tool to leverage, and being cognizant of when you're in meetings that, especially if not everybody is in the room, how do you structure that? We just had a meeting this week. We had 3 people who were remote, and I purposely did not go on the whiteboard because we didn't have cameras or anything for them to see. So we had to use Jamboard, and everybody in the room was like, I would so love the whiteboard, but we had to make sure we had a tool that everybody could contribute to. And so I just think we need to be much more conscious of how we're working. I also think that, the 2 words that I'm using quite a bit lately are just, you said it too, just how do we be more intentional? And so because we don't have the opportunity to kind of see each other in the hallway and say, hey, Chris, what was that thing you were going to do? Or who was going to make that decision? Or, we have to be much more clear and intentional about what we're wanting to do as a team, because we don't have the luxury anymore of, seeing people in the hallways or having those kind of interstitial moments. Yeah,
I agree. When you think about the book, like when you finished it, what was the main thing you really wanted people to take away from it? What would be the one thing you really want people to take away from the book?
That culture is always evolving, that it's not a static thing that is owned by HR, and it's an initiative that is a list of values that get placed on a website.
Yeah,
it is an ongoing practice and should continue to be looked at as an opportunity to integrate how we're working into everything we're doing.
Mm-hmm. And is it okay for subcultures to exist? Is there such thing as that?
Yeah, I talk about that in the book. I think I'm a big believer of teams really having their own identity. I think when it gets complicated and a little confusing is when they create their own culture and their own set of values and their own, processes, God forbid. So and so often right now, as you know, we're so many companies are talking about internal mobility and how do we make sure that people get a more broad skill set. And so if I'm moving from one team to another, I would hope that there's some consistency in how we're working, the processes that we're using. And, I had somebody at a company I was working with, and it was an engineer, and he's like, I'm so confused because we have these values and behaviors, but then we created our own in our team, and I don't know what I'm getting evaluated on. And
that
so
is confusing,
again, let's make it simple. Let's not be confusing. I do encourage teams to have, their own purpose, and, they obviously can have their own rituals, but hopefully there's also this responsibility and accountability to show how that ties to the greater organizational system.
Yeah.
Because again, if it doesn't, then I feel like I'm in my own little.
It creates like a us and them mentality. Because I like an example, like in my previous company, it was like sales had its own culture, and marketing is a good example. It was like the sales versus marketing, and the cult. Like I got an opportunity to work in both, and I was like, whoa, this is like completely different. Like marketing was like really like, there wasn't really a culture, for example, of innovation. Like if you made a mistake, you were punished. Whereas if in sales, if you tried something and you failed, it was like, try again. Or no, this is what we learned. This is how we're going to shift. This is how we're going to change it. And it was like, oh, great. Like I'm empowered and rewarded. Actually, we used to reward team members for making mistakes. I'm like, I'm glad that you learned something, you implemented it. Yes, it didn't work, but encouraged that. Went into marketing. It was like, everything was like command control. This has to be perfect. And in the business, you can feel it. You could literally feel it when you. And it's funny because each function was separated by a floor. So you had like sales on one floor, marketing on another floor, finance on another. So I almost said like each floor had its own culture, and it was so weird. It felt so disconnected as a business. I didn't know it at the time because that was my only company I ever worked in. So I assumed that was the norm. But when I left that environment, I was like, that was really strange. Like, but I think a lot of companies are like that still, even to this day, as well. Yeah. So yeah, I love it. Well, listen, before I let you go, where can people connect with you? If they want to reach out to you personally, where can they connect with you? And also, where can they grab a copy of the book? Yeah,
so my website, melissadaimler.com, is up, and you can read me there. And all the places that you can get my book are on there too, but you can always go to the good old Amazon. I'm on LinkedIn, Melissa Daimler. I do try to stay off Instagram and Twitter, but I am on there. So I'm Daimler, Melissa Daimler. And
nothing. Well, look, I'm really happy for you. Congrats, first and foremost. I know how much, and I say I haven't written a book, but I've interviewed enough authors to know how much time and energy kind of, they always they're like, Chris, it's like a part of you. It
is a very vulnerable process, for sure.
As well. Yeah. Well, I think, as we said before we jumped on the call, now is the time. I think it couldn't be better timing, and I'm super excited to get it in the hands of all of our listeners. So I appreciate you coming on the show and sharing it.
Thank you.
For everyone listening, as always, the links are below. So whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on your favorite platform, click the links below, go and connect, grab a copy of the book. Apart from that, Melissa, enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.